Lieutenant Norman Eric Wallace, a 26-year-old Canadian, had a keen eye and admirable courage. He was an observer in World War I, responsible for watching and reporting enemy movements, a vital and incredibly dangerous task. Norman enlisted in the Army with a mix of patriotism and a desire for adventure. He left his small town in Ontario, where he worked as a teacher, and now found himself in the muddy trenches of Europe, a completely different and frightening world. On a cold and silent night, Norman was called for an observation mission. The moon was covered by dark clouds, and the only illumination came from the sporadic flashes of distant explosions. The tension in the air was palpable as he and his partner, Corporal Henry, crawled to an advanced observation position. As they settled in, Norman adjusted his binoculars and began to scan no man's land. The scene was desolate, craters from bombs, barbed wire, and scattered bodies. Every sound, every movement in the darkness could mean imminent danger. Norman's heart was pounding, but he remained calm. Suddenly, he spotted something. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement near the enemy lines. He focused his binoculars and saw the glint of bayonets and German helmets. They were preparing for a surprise attack. Norman knew he had to act quickly. Henry, we have to go back and alert the command, he whispered urgently. They started to retreat, trying to move without making noise. But fate had other plans. A shot rang out in the darkness, followed by a groan of pain. Henry was hit. Norman felt a chill run down his spine and stopped, his heart beating even faster. He looked at Henry, who had fallen, clutching his bloody shoulder. Go, Norman. Warn them, Henry murmured weakly. Norman was torn between loyalty to his friend and the need to complete the mission. He knew he couldn't leave Henry there, but he also knew that hundreds of lives depended on the information he had. War left no room for easy choices. Taking a deep breath, Norman made a silent promise to return for Henry and ran towards the Allied lines. Every step felt like a challenge, the uneven ground and darkness making the escape difficult. He could hear the sounds of war around him, gunfire, explosions, and the distant cries of soldiers. But nothing mattered more than reaching the command and reporting what he had seen. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Norman spotted the lights of the Allied headquarters. With his heart racing and body exhausted, he ran inside, announcing the imminent threat with a voice trembling with urgency. They're coming. The Germans are planning a surprise attack. We need to prepare now. The commander looked at him, eyes wide with concern, but immediately began giving orders. The race against time had begun, and Norman knew that somehow, he had to go back to save Henry. And so, with the battle about to begin, Lieutenant Norman Eric Wallace prepared to face the longest and most challenging night of his life. Norman was determined to go back and save Henry, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a plan and some help. He ran to the commander, who was coordinating the defenses. Commander, I need to go back and get my partner. He's been hit and is trapped out there, Norman said, his voice filled with urgency and desperation. The commander looked at him for a moment, assessing the situation. You're brave, Lieutenant, but going out there now is suicide. The area is crawling with enemies. I can't leave him out there, sir. Henry is a good man. And he saved me more times than I can count. Please, give me a chance, Norman pleaded, his eyes full of determination. The commander sighed, recognizing the courage and loyalty in the young lieutenant. All right. You'll have a small rescue team. But be quick and careful. We can't afford to lose more men. Norman thanked him with a firm nod and quickly gathered 3 soldiers: Jack, an experienced marksman, Sam, a field medic, and Tom, who knew the terrain well. They prepared quickly, grabbing weapons and medical supplies. We're bringing Henry back, Norman said, trying to sound confident, though his heart was heavy with worry. The group slipped out of the headquarters, moving silently through the trenches and avoiding illuminated areas. Every sound in the darkness seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The tension was almost unbearable. Norman led the way, guided by his memory of the path. His senses were on high alert, and he could feel the cold sweat running down his forehead. Finally, they spotted Henry's fallen figure, partially covered by darkness and debris. There he is," Norman whispered, pointing. They approached quickly but cautiously. Sam began to examine Henry, while Jack and Tom kept watch, alert to any enemy movement. "He's alive, but he's lost a lot of blood. We need to get him out of here fast," Sam said, starting to administer first aid. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps and low voices approaching made Norman's heart race. He looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the direction of the threat. "Quick, we need to move out," Jack whispered, already raising his weapon and aiming into the darkness. Norman and Tom carefully lifted Henry, trying to make as little noise as possible. Sam continued to stabilize the wound as they slowly retreated, moving back towards their lines. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Norman could feel the panic rising in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, they saw the faint light of the Allied lines in the distance. But before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a shot rang out, shattering the night silence. Norman threw himself to the ground, instinctively shielding Henry with his body. Jack and Tom returned fire, while Sam tried to stay calm and continue tending to Henry. "We need support, now," Norman shouted, not knowing if his words would reach headquarters. The situation was becoming desperate, and Norman knew they were in a race against time and the approaching enemies. He steeled himself for the fight, determined to protect his men and ensure Henry's safe return. The battle was just beginning, and the night promised to be long and full of dangers. The gunfire continued intensely, and Norman knew he had to think fast. Each passing bullet whizzed through the air, increasing the group's tension. He looked at Jack, who was focused, shooting with precision, and at Tom, who kept his eyes peeled in the darkness. "We need to make a strategic retreat," Norman shouted, trying to be heard over the chaos. "Let's use the trenches for cover." With effort, they lifted Henry again, moving toward the trenches. Norman's heart was pounding, and adrenaline was coursing through his veins. The sound of enemy footsteps was getting closer, and he could feel the imminent threat of being surrounded. Suddenly, a grenade exploded nearby, sending chunks of earth and debris flying through the air. Norman threw himself to the ground, shielding Henry again. The impact was deafening, and for a moment, everything seemed like a blur. He felt his head throbbing and his body aching, but he knew he couldn't stop. Come on, come on," Sam shouted, already helping to lift Henry again. Finally, they reached the trenches. The cover provided temporary relief, but the danger was far from over. Norman could hear the enemy's shouts, now closer. He knew their only chance was to call for reinforcements. "Jack, can you signal the headquarters?" Norman asked urgently. Jack nodded, pulling a flare from his pocket. He fired the flare into the sky, the bright light briefly illuminating the battlefield. Norman silently prayed that the signal would be seen in time. The group continued moving through the trenches, trying to avoid the most exposed points. Henry was conscious, but visibly weak. Time was running out, and Norman knew they needed immediate help. "I heard something," Tom whispered, stopping abruptly. Everyone fell silent, trying to listen through the distant sounds of the battle. Norman held his breath, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. And then, he heard it, the sound of hurried but familiar footsteps. Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness, and Norman felt a wave of relief upon recognizing the Allied helmets. "Reinforcements," he shouted, raising a hand to signal. The Allied soldiers advanced quickly, taking defensive positions around the group. Norman felt a mix of relief and adrenaline as they helped carry Henry to a safe place. One of the reinforcement officers, Sergeant Miller, approached Norman. "You did a great job, Lieutenant. Let's get everyone out of here now." With the reinforcement securing the area, they began to retreat to the headquarters. Each step felt like a victory, and Norman felt hope rising again. They were almost there, almost safe. But just when they thought the danger had passed, a scream echoed through the night. An Allied soldier fell, hit by enemy fire. Panic tried to set in, but Norman remained calm. "Keep moving forward. Don't stop," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear. Finally, they saw the steady light of the headquarters. They managed to cross the last line of defense and entered the safe area. Medics rushed to help Henry and the other wounded, while Norman allowed himself a moment to take a deep breath. He looked at his companions, exhausted but alive, and felt deep gratitude. He knew the battle wasn't over, but they had overcome a significant obstacle. "Thank you, everyone," Norman said, his voice filled with emotion. "You were incredible." But before they could rest, the commander approached, with a serious expression. "Norman, we have new information. We need to discuss the next mission. Get ready." The night was still long, and Norman knew more challenges were coming. But with his companions by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Norman barely had time to catch his breath before being called to the command tent. He felt the weight of responsibility growing, but he couldn't show weakness. His men depended on him. Entering the tent, he saw the commander hunched over a map, surrounded by officers. "Lieutenant Wallace, good job bringing your man back. But the situation is getting more complicated," said the commander, without looking up from the map. "What's the new mission, sir?" Norman asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've received information that the enemy is planning a large-scale attack at dawn. We need a reconnaissance team to confirm enemy movements and, if possible, sabotage their communications," the commander explained. Norman felt a chill run down his spine. The mission was risky but essential. "I'm ready, sir. Who will go with me?" "Jack, Tom, and 2 more men. We need speed and discretion." "You have until dawn," replied the commander, finally looking at Norman. "Good luck." Norman nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins. He left the tent and gathered his team. Jack and Tom were exhausted, but the determination in their eyes was evident. The other 2 men, Davis and Lewis, were new to the group but seemed ready for the challenge. "We have an important mission. We need to confirm enemy movements and, if possible, sabotage their communications. We have until dawn. Stay together and be quick," Norman said, trying to inspire confidence in his team. They grabbed their gear and moved quickly out of the Allied lines. The night was dark and cold, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger, every step was taken with caution. As they advanced, Norman felt the weight of responsibility grow. He knew that the lives of his men depended on his leadership and quick decisions. The terrain was treacherous, full of craters and debris. They moved slowly, using the cover of the terrain to avoid being seen. Finally, they spotted the enemy camp. The tents were scattered, with faint lights illuminating the surroundings. Norman signaled for the men to crouch, carefully observing enemy movements. They needed to get closer to gather detailed information. "Let's split into 2 groups," Norman whispered. "Jack and Davis, you come with me. Tom and Lewis, cover our rear and be ready for anything." The men nodded and split up silently. Norman, Jack, and Davis crept closer to the enemy tents, their hearts pounding. They could hear the enemy soldiers talking, the sounds muffled by the distance. Suddenly, an alarm sounded. Norman froze, his blood running cold. Something had gone wrong. He looked at Jack and Davis, who were equally tense. And we need to get out of here, now. Norman whispered, trying to stay calm. They began to retreat slowly, trying not to attract attention. But the enemies were alert, and the sound of hurried footsteps indicated they were being pursued. Norman signaled to Tom and Lewis, who quickly joined them. Let's go, quickly," he shouted, the urgency clear in his voice. They started running through the trenches, enemy bullets whizzing around them. Norman felt panic trying to take over, but he kept moving, determined to get his men back safely. They were almost back to the Allied lines when an explosion threw them to the ground. Norman felt a sharp pain in his back and looked around, trying to find his comrades. The dust and smoke made it hard to see, but he could hear the cries of his men. Jack. Tom. Where are you? He shouted, trying to get up. His ears were ringing, and he could feel the blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. As Norman tried to rest, a messenger burst into the tent, panting and wide-eyed. Lieutenant Wallace, the commander needs you now. It's urgent. Norman stood up immediately, feeling the exhaustion weigh on his bones, but pushing it to the back of his mind. He followed the messenger back to the command tent, where the commander was once again hunched over the map, this time with an even graver expression. Norman, we've just received reports that the enemy attack will be larger than we thought. They're bringing in heavy reinforcements. We need eyes on the field to confirm the positions and the number of troops. You're the best observer we have. Can you do it? Norman nodded, feeling the pressure of the mission. Yes, sir. When do we leave? As soon as possible. Take the same men. I trust you can do this, the commander said, his eyes showing the seriousness of the situation. Norman returned to the tent where his men were resting. We have a new mission. We need to confirm enemy positions and troop numbers. We need to leave now. The men quickly got up, grabbing their weapons and gear. Even though they were exhausted, there was a look of determination in their eyes. They knew that each mission was a matter of life and death, not just for them, but for everyone on the battlefield. The night was still dark as they left the Allied lines again. The silence was dense, the air heavy with tension. Norman led the way, his senses sharp for any sign of danger. The darkness seemed more oppressive than before, every shadow a possible threat. They moved slowly, using the terrain to hide. Finally, they reached an observation point where they could see the enemy camp. What they saw made Norman's blood run cold. There were far more soldiers than he expected, and they were clearly preparing for a major attack. We need to get closer to count the units, Norman whispered, looking at Jack. Jack nodded, his eyes showing the same concern that Norman felt. They crawled closer, each movement carefully calculated. Norman adjusted his binoculars, quickly counting the tanks and artillery units. The enemy was gearing up for a massive offensive. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps made them freeze. Norman signaled for the men to crouch even lower, holding their breath. A group of enemy soldiers was patrolling the area, their flashlights sweeping the field. Norman's heart pounded wildly as he tried not to move. The soldiers passed, but the danger was far from over. They knew that any false move could mean discovery and possibly death. Norman waited until the sound of footsteps disappeared before signaling them to continue. As they slowly moved away, Norman felt something hit his foot. He looked down and saw a grenade, just a few inches away, its pin still intact. Panic gripped him for a moment, but he quickly controlled himself, moving with extreme care to avoid triggering the explosive. Finally, they managed to get far enough away to feel relatively safe. We have what we need. Let's get back, Norman whispered, relief mixed with the urgency to get out as fast as possible. The walk back was tense, but they finally reached the Allied lines. Norman ran to the commander, delivering the full report. They have many more troops than we thought. We need to prepare for a major attack. The commander nodded, already starting to give orders to reinforce the defenses. "A good job, Norman. You and your men saved many lives tonight." Norman felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. He looked at his men, who were sitting down to rest, knowing they had done their duty, but aware that the real battle was yet to come. The war continued, and Norman knew that each day would bring new challenges. But with courage, determination, and the strength of his comrades, he was ready to face whatever came. Norman felt the weight of responsibility more than ever as he watched the commander coordinate the defenses. Preparations were in full swing, and every soldier in the field was on high alert. He knew that the upcoming battle would be one of the hardest they had ever faced. The sky began to lighten with the first rays of dawn as Norman gathered his men for a quick briefing. "They're coming in large numbers. We need to be ready for anything. Stay alert and look out for each other." Jack, with his usual optimistic manner, patted Norman on the shoulder. "We've got your back, Lieutenant. We'll handle this." Norman nodded, trying to hide his own apprehension. We'll do our best, Jack." The front line was set, with soldiers taking their positions and weapons at the ready. Norman and his team were at the forefront, waiting for the first sign of attack. The silence was almost deafening, filled with tension and anticipation. Suddenly, the sound of distant drums and shouts began to fill the air. The enemy was on their way. Norman's heart raced, but he remained steadfast. He looked around, seeing the same determination in his comrades' faces. The first shot rang out, breaking the silence like thunder. The battlefield erupted into chaos, with bullets whizzing through the air and explosions shaking the ground. Norman shouted orders, trying to coordinate the defense while keeping his rifle steady. Amid the chaos, he saw Jack in the distance, helping a wounded soldier to his feet. Tom and Lewis were by his side, covering their positions with precise shots. It was an intense fight, each second a battle for survival. Norman ducked behind an improvised barricade, quickly reloading his rifle. The noise was overwhelming, and the smoke made it hard to see more than a few meters ahead. He knew they had to hold the line at all costs. Suddenly, a flash to his right caught his attention. He turned just in time to see a group of enemy soldiers trying to flank their positions. Right side. "They're trying to surround us," Norman shouted, pointing. Jack and Tom reacted immediately, moving to confront the new threat. The gunfire grew even more intense, and Norman felt a wave of desperation as he realized they were being pressured from all sides. "We can't let them surround us," he shouted, trying to be heard above the din. Hold the line." The battle became a frantic struggle. Norman felt a bullet graze his arm, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on keeping his men alive. Time seemed to drag on, each second an eternity of violence and chaos. Finally, Allied reinforcements arrived. The sight of Allied troops advancing gave Norman and his men a new wave of hope. With renewed strength, they pushed the enemy back, regaining control of the battlefield. Norman looked around, trying to assess the situation. The ground was covered with debris and bodies, but they had managed to hold the line. He felt a wave of relief, but he knew the fight was far from over. As the day wore on, the intensity of the battle diminished. The enemy retreated, and the Allied troops began to consolidate their positions. Norman finally had a moment to breathe, sitting heavily on the ground. "We made it, at least for now," said Jack, sitting next to him. "You did a great job, Lieutenant." Norman shook his head, still trying to process everything that had happened. "It was a team effort. I don't know how we would have managed without all of you." They sat in silence for a moment, just absorbing the temporary relief. But deep down, they all knew that the war was far from over. Norman looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the devastated battlefield. "We need to prepare for what's next," he said, his voice firm again. "The battle may be over, but the war continues, 2 years after that intense night on the front lines, Norman Eric Wallace's life took a dramatic and unexpected turn. During an aerial reconnaissance mission, Norman's plane was shot down. He suffered severe facial injuries due to burns from the fire on the plane. The doctors who treated him were shocked by the severity of his injuries, but were determined to help him. The plastic surgery performed on Norman was revolutionary for its time. Skin grafts were taken from his buttocks to repair the scars, while skin from his neck and chin was moved to cover other affected areas. The doctors also used skin from his shoulder to cover his cheeks and upper lip. Despite the medical advancements, Norman had to use a prosthetic face to hide the more severe scars. While in the hospital, Norman faced moments of despair and pain, but also found a ray of light in the darkness. He fell in love with a young nurse named Emily, whose kindness and inner strength brought comfort to his wounded heart. They married in 1920, but their happiness was short-lived. Tragically, Emily died of cancer a few days before their first wedding anniversary. Emily's loss left a deep mark on Norman, but he continued his military career, seeking purpose amid his pain. Promoted to major, Norman dedicated himself even more to military service, but his personal life was marked by loneliness. He lived until late 1974, when he succumbed to lung cancer. Most of his life was spent in hotels and cottages in Langamarch Wells, an isolated village in Wales. Despite his striking appearance and the hardships he faced, Norman became a beloved figure to the locals, who respected him for his courage and resilience. Norman frequently visited the local pubs, where he shared stories of his battles and the people he had met over the years. His voice, though marked by suffering, always carried a strength that inspired those around him. The village children called him Uncle Norman, and loved hearing him talk about his adventures. One night, while looking at the starry sky from his cottage, Norman felt a strange sense of peace. He knew his time was running out, but he was at peace with it. There was one last mission he wanted to fulfill, a promise he had made to himself years ago. Norman took out an old wooden box he kept under his bed. Inside were letters, photos, and mementos from his life. Among them was a letter from Emily, written shortly before their wedding. He opened it and reread the loving words she had written. Those words were a reminder of the love he had lost, but also of the strength he had found. With the letter in hand, Norman decided he needed to do something special. There was a place, a small lake hidden in the hills of Langamarch Wells, where he and Emily used to walk. He knew it would be the perfect place for his final tribute. As he walked to the lake, he felt Emily's presence beside him, as if she were guiding his steps. The wind blew softly, and the trees whispered ancient secrets. Norman knew he was exactly where he needed to be. When he reached the lake, he knelt by the water's edge, looking at the reflection of the stars on the calm surface. With trembling hands, he placed Emily's letter in the water, letting it float. It was his way of saying goodbye, of letting go of the past, and finding the peace he had long sought. As Norman knelt by the lake, a deep sense of calm enveloped him. He stayed there for a while, just watching Emily's letter float on the water, feeling that, somehow, she was with him, sharing that moment. The gentle breeze whispered through the trees, and Norman remembered the many walks he and Emily had taken there, talking about the future, dreaming together. It was as if time had stopped, and for a brief moment, he could feel her presence beside him, holding his hand again. As he stood up, Norman looked at the lake one last time, imprinting that image in his mind. With a lighter heart, he began to walk back to his chalet. Each step seemed full of meaning, but also carried a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. Upon arriving at the chalet, Norman sat in his favorite chair, looking out at the hills he knew so well. He took out a notebook and began to write his memories, wanting to leave a legacy of his life and experiences for others to learn from and be inspired by. Norman knew his time was coming to an end, but he was at peace with it. He had completed his final mission, found a way to say goodbye, and made peace with his past. In his final days, he found comfort in the community that had embraced him, the friends he had made, and the stories he had shared. On a quiet morning, Norman closed his eyes for the last time, feeling finally at peace. He was found in his chair, a serene smile on his face and his notebook of memories by his side. News of his death spread quickly through the village, and everyone gathered to honor the brave man who had touched so many lives with his strength and resilience. At Norman's funeral, the residents of Langemarch Wells came together to pay their respects. Children, adults, and the elderly shared stories of how he had inspired and helped each of them. The lake where he had left Emily's letter became a place of memory and reverence, where many went to reflect and find peace. The story of Norman Eric Wallace, the lieutenant who faced war, love, and loss, and who found redemption in the end, lives on in the hearts of those who knew him and in the pages of his notebook. His life was a testament to courage, love, and the relentless search for peace and meaning. If you enjoyed this moving story about the life and battles of Lieutenant Norman Eric Wallace, don't forget to like and subscribe to our War Stories channel. Here, we share stories of courage, sacrifice, and inspiration from people who lived through extraordinary times. Your participation is essential to us, and together, we can keep the memory of those who made history alive. Let's continue this journey together, exploring the past and finding inspiration for the future.